Greetings, I am AbsolX Guardian and I have once again resurrected my channel from the dead, this time to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's. I am here to present what seems to be a completely novel framework for analyzing the Fazbear Fright stories. When I see people debating Frights Fiction versus Stitchline, I see people considering it a matter of all or nothing. So I decided to read the stories with one idea in mind. What if some stories are in the game continuity, while some are in-universe stories published by Fazbear Entertainment? And then others are fictional stories directly based on true events, just like the relationship between What We Found and FNAF 3. This is an anthology series with each element cleanly divided. So what if we analyze each story based on what is present in its text alone, plus, where it connects? What if some non-Stitchline stories also happen? And what if some Stitchline stories are only fictionalizations of the real events? The main subject of focus will be how well does the supernatural events of each story fit into what has already been established in the game's universe as possible. So, Remnant possessing stuff, healing people, there being psychic projection and knowledge as depicted in the week before. Just because there's no reason to believe that something did happen, that's no ding against the story. The question is, do all the supernatural elements break our suspension of disbelief? For this, I will consider the Silver Ice trilogy to be a valid counterfactual to the game's continuity. Everything that happens in it is something that could have happened in the game's universe and just didn't. The key information provided in this trilogy has then gone on to be explicitly referred to in the game, so that's enough for me. As for illusion discs, I'll go into that in another episode. The summaries I provide for each story will be extremely brief. If you want a full play-by-play analysis, I recommend you check out Gibby's ongoing series on the topic, where he goes full literary analysis on each story. I will also be attempting to give an estimate for when each story takes place, though I admit this process may be inherently flawed. My main touchstone is technology, but how are you supposed to use how advanced people's phones are as evidence when you have bipedal robots capable of pathfinding in a completely uncontrolled environment in the 80s, something we don't even have now? Candy Bunny's video, analyzing all the evidence for when FNAF 1 takes place, found that the phone Bronwyn has in the week before knocks out most of the earlier dates. Is this poor historical fiction research? Stealth world building? On the other hand, despite Tales from the Pizzaplex being set in the near future, there is no sci-fi technology that is unrelated to Fazbear Entertainment. I will also be taking it as a given that FNAF 3 takes place sometime between 2015 and 2017. Gibby has a good video explaining how nothing else makes sense. I will also be taking it as a given that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has multiple locations, and it is a national chain that uses a franchising model outside of the original locations in Hurricane, Utah. Ralph referring to multiple locations in FNAF 3 is, in my opinion, sufficient evidence. There also needs to be pre-existing franchising infrastructure for there to be training material for Mike and Pizzeria Sim. It also makes sense from a storytelling perspective when you're trying to tell stories from a wider world than the narrow focus of the main games, which is exactly how the back of all the books builds the series. Not everything that happens has to be directly related to the events of the game. This is a terrifying world where hauntings are happening left and right due to Remnant. We just see the selection that are directly associated with the Fazbear Entertainment brand in the stories that take place in the game continuity. I'll be using the graphic novels to provide visual aids in my videos. I will not be considering them as evidence. I think what Plushtrap looks like, and the fact that what is clearly Molten Freddy is drawn as this, should be evidence enough that the graphic novels are not a source of new details. The most controversial assumption I have made is that the Stitchline Stingers,
It's fact.
that was the mindset I went into reading the books. I will be spending my analysis of each individual stinger disproving the counter-arguments. You've seen the thumbnail. But first, I would like to go over the reasons why the stingers are in continuity. Unfortunately, my main argument is why not, but let me explain. The movie and the Silver Eyes trilogy take place in their own continuities because they are telling what can best be termed as a main branch story. The protagonist of each series has to be the main actor in their stories. That's because the trilogy is a standard middle grade action horror series, and the movie didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the Assassin's Creed movie and present a story that is incomprehensible to the average moviegoer. But Fazbear Frights isn't like this. The protagonists of each story have far less power over their circumstances. They aren't defeating William Afton, he has probably never even heard of them. They often spend most of their story having no idea what is going on. These are fundamentally side stories. So why not make the stingers and most of the stories in continuity? And when you have an idea that doesn't work in the lore of the setting, or you want to not have to worry about lore when it comes to small details, well, that's what Frights Fiction is for. Because believe me, there are quite a few stories that feels like when the writer's room has to execute every single premise they come up with, regardless of how strong it is, because they need to hit an episode quota. Everyone is just accepted the week before is in the game's continuity, and it is also telling a side story. I also think there are good odds on Scott having written the Stingers himself. When Scott describes the writing process for Frights, he describes a pretty standard ghostwriting arrangement. In fact, all of the authors for the series are employed by a ghostwriting company. I think the only reason we have specific author credits for each story, and even know their names, is because Scott wouldn't accept not crediting them. But there is no author credited for the Stingers. They also aren't presented like a normal part of the book. They are bonus content that are after the About the Author pages. The term Stitchline Stinger is a fan name. They don't even have the header of epilogue. In the ebook table of contents, they are called teasers, which I suspect is just a placeholder necessitated by the fact that ebooks require all sections to be on the table of contents. I don't have access to any physical copies, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're excluded from the table of contents on the physical copies. These are secrets, separated from the presentation of the in-universe book. I have decided to organize this series based not on the book each story comes from, but rather on overarching topics, so that I can better present topics and the connection between different stories. I have also decided to start with the topics where I feel I have the most to say, to increase the chance I will make the most important videos before I lose motivation. So, here's the slate of stories I will be discussing today. The stories I consider the most connected to the Andrew thread of the Stingers, up until the seventh Stinger. The first Stinger is more tied to the Eleanor thread, and really just sets up the Stitch Wraith and Detective Larson, the protagonists of the Stingers, so I will be skipping that in my analysis. Fetch was the first story I read that I initially classified as actually happening as presented, and I still believe that,
Well, this story is true? Yes, it is.
It follows a kid named Greg as he and his friends explore an abandoned Freddy's that is explicitly located in coastal Washington state, where Greg finds an animatronic dog in the prize counter. Fetch links up with his phone and starts cryptically trying to fulfill his wishes and texting him. But Monkey Paw style, this becomes Fetch fulfilling his wishes in ways Greg didn't expect, such as killing the neighbor's dog that bothered him, taking his uncle's lucky finger, and ultimately culminating in interpreting his desire for his crush by killing her and bringing her corpse to Greg. Fetch likely takes place sometime in the late aughts to early 2010s. Greg has no trouble understanding Fetch's texting slang which specifically developed due to the technological limitations of pre-touchscreen phones. However, there is a reference to a clock app, so it is after 2007 and the release of the first iPhone, but not by much, as Greg probably had a flip phone a few years ago, given he's in high school and his uncle is quite wealthy. In Gibby's analysis video, he points out how the Freddy's Greg and his friends explore seems trapped in time. It is insufficiently decayed, and Greg's narration references the musical Brigadoon, where a town in the Scottish Highland only appears once every century. While I'm currently exploring ideas about Remnant being able to manipulate the passage of time to figure out what's going on with Into the Pit, I don't necessarily think understanding that part of the story is required for my theories. It makes more sense for Fetch to be a later addition to the pizzeria, as its instructions explicitly reference phones. Even if supernatural actors can change text, as seen in FNAF 1, they wouldn't know about smartphones if they died before they were invented. While Gibby brings up that there was a Game Boy peripheral that connected to your phone in 2001, that was only available in Japan, which had smartphone-like features on their phones before the US. I don't even think the way its closure is described is necessarily continuity breaking. This was part of a pizza chain that closed down after something happened to one of them. It doesn't say the entire chain went bankrupt. Either the MCI or the Bite of 87 could have happened when the Oregon location was already in a vulnerable financial position for normal reasons, and the Brad press hurt the business enough that the entire location closed down. I think Fetch is the single most important story in the series for overall world building. Greg is interested in a pseudoscientific interpretation of the zero-point field, which is basically manifesting psychic projection and the ability to affect matter with your will. But I don't think this is pseudoscience in the FNAF universe. While cranks could totally find their way into teaching AP Science at a high school, there are references to there still being ongoing research into random energy generators and the zero-point field. Such ideas were once new fields of research until the research concluded that it was all bunk. But if there is still ongoing research instead of people just trying to sell self-help books, that would mean that this isn't what happened in the FNAF universe. This would also be consistent with Gibby's idea that Remnant was inspired by the concept of memories etching themselves into metal in the part of Autobiography of the Yogi that was the original source of garbled audio used in FNAF 1. This would give precedent to the supernatural aspects of FNAF 1 being based on real-life pseudoscience. As ShadowF on Reddit described, the field would be how spirits are able to control animatronics. They're exerting their will onto the metal, and since all that's left of them is the will, it works. This is also the source of the call that draws William and Scrap Baby to the Six Pizzeria. Henry is literally manifesting it. Gibby also pointed out that this would explain all the evidence of the locations themselves, especially the Prime/FNAF 1 location being haunted. It's the field. It also decreases the amount of suspension of disbelief required in fright stories where, just like Greg, characters get what they want, just not in the way they expected. As Kimberly says, it's like a monkey trying to fly a plane. Which brings me to my interpretation of the story. It's pretty heavily implied that Fetch is a medium which allows Greg to unknowingly more easily interface with the field, and is driven by his intentions, not just what it can parse from having access to his phone. But I would like to go further and suggest that Fetch was an experiment intentionally left in an abandoned Freddy's, where finding an unmodified version of the toy/animatronic wouldn't be entirely unexpected. Greg is drawn to the location, where there is evidence of someone sneaking around the location at the same time. He has nightmares involving being chased by a faceless man. At the end, he wonders if he hasn't been manipulated by someone the whole time. I would like to propose that the person who planted Fetch was none other than Greg's gay-coded Uncle Dare. This is a conclusion I came to after just reading this story. Now, admittedly, this is a conclusion based on figuring out which of the characters mentioned in a story fits best and rolling with it, but there is evidence. Uncle Dare is an eccentric inventor of car parts, and if any field would lead someone to discovering Remnant, because there's Remnant inside Fetch, I'll get to that later, it would be the single most common cause of death while in contact with metal in our current age. He's not dedicated to that field, having general financial success from his investments. He's also described as tinkering in his workshop. He could have moved into trying to control fate, and either his nephew's interest in the topic inspired him, or an offhand comment from him is what inspired Greg. He's such a three-dimensional feeling character for having so little to do directly with the plot. It's not like how child protagonists have to have two parents, because the lack of one or more has its own characterization implications. Finally, his hair is dyed purple. In FNAF, purple has connotations of villainy. His hair didn't have to be dyed specifically purple to contribute to the gay coding. It could have been green, blue, or even just that it was long. I think what happened is that Dare modified Fetch, and then to see if it would work even when someone wasn't intentionally trying to affect the field, called someone to the abandoned Freddy's. He didn't intend for it to be his nephew that picked it up, just like how he wasn't expecting it to take his finger. But that is irony that contributes to the story's explicitly stated themes of being careful what you wish for and control being an illusion. It's like a monkey flying a plane indeed. Now, as clean as it would make my theories for Dare to have been the person who killed Andrew as a source of remnant for his machine, Andrew explicitly recounts his memories as him becoming part of Fetch after the man who killed him explodes all over a Fazbear distribution center. I do think there is significance to the fact that there is emphasis on Fetch's battery being the most haunted, when the remnant goo would have primarily gotten on the outside of anything it hit. I think Dare harvested some of Andrew's remnant from various things that infected and put it inside Fetch. Perhaps one of his investments was being on the board of Fazbear Entertainment. We also have precedent for Andrew haunted toys being modified by a malevolent force, as Eleanor modifies the plush trap chaser in Out of Stock. Speaking of Out of Stock, we will not be talking about it in detail in this episode. I'm going to save a more detailed analysis of that story for my third plan episode, which is about the in-universe publication history of the Fazbear Fright stories and the in-universe FNAF franchise in general. So just accept for now that
It happened.
but I do need to speak on its timeline. It unambiguously takes place after 2007, as a reference is made to iPhones. However, Oscar is unable to afford any kind of phone. Contrast that to Into the Pit, where Oswald, who is in a similar financial situation, has what the video game depicts as a feature phone. Right now, you can get low phone specs for less than what the plush trap chaser retailed for. The first half of Stinger 2 ties directly into the events of Out of Stock. An unhoused man named Grimm observes the Stitch Wraith gathering the pieces of the plush trap chaser after it was hit by a train. However, the timeline analysis for Out of Stock only provides a lower bound for when the present time period of the Stingers is, as this could be years after the events of the story, although probably not all that many. The other part of this stinger is Detective Larson interviewing Margie about how the face of the Stitch Wraith is the same as the doll she had been decorating for her now late ward Jake. I'm not sure how the police knew this. My best guess is that she reported it missing after the events of the real Jake and had a fairly recent picture for sending to Evan, Jake's father. She says that she's been living in this house for 3 years. While the Ultimate Guide uses this to say that Jake has been dead for 3 years before the events of the Stingers, Margie had already been taking care of him for 3 years before he died. So instead, this means that it has been less than a year since Jake died. There isn't much to analyze about this stinger, so let's continue to analyzing the real Jake itself. This is quite an unusual story, as nothing really supernatural happens until the end, so it's easy to believe
It happened.
especially as it's basically essential to the Stingers. It is about a 9-year-old kid named Jake who has a primitive neural ectodermal tumor. His father is serving overseas and his mother is deceased. He's taken care of by a woman named Margie. Every night before he goes to sleep, he talks to an imaginary friend in a bedroom cabinet named Simon, who asks what the real Jake has done, encouraging him to imagine what he would do if he wasn't sick. It is revealed that Simon is actually Jake's father, Evan, calling and using a voice changer to give his kid not just a friend, but keeping him from forgetting what a normal life is like. Inside the cabinet is a doll that Margie draws the physical consequences, like a skinned knee or a tongue dyed by candy, of each day's adventure. Evan always arranges the story so that the same physical thing happens to both Simon and the real Jake. How Evan was able to do this without any concerns about it being disrupted by an overnight mission, yet Skadill being deployed somewhere in a front lines position that results in him being killed by an IED, I have no idea. After Evan dies, Margie still overhears Jake talking to Simon. When Jake dies shortly afterwards, the Simon/real Jake doll walks out of the cabinet it's contained within and later ends up forming the face of the Stitch Wraith, providing it with Jake's memories. However, it is impossible for the doll to be directly possessed by Jake's remnant. It is specifically described as cloth, although its face is presumably plastic. That means it doesn't have any metal in it, and even if it did, Jake never touched the doll, even after he died. So instead, it was likely Margie's grief and the time and care she took to decorate it that brought it to life. This is exactly what happened with Ella in the Silver Eyes trilogy. It doesn't have the real Charlie's remnant in it. Instead, the Charlie we know has her memories because of Henry's emotion and the care he took to make the bodies. The story says exactly this. If you were to infuse an object with enough love and intention, would it have life? Evan apparently thought so, and maybe Margie did too now. Since everything Simon said was just to prompt Jake's imagination, and all of the physical marks were the same as what the real Jake experienced, that is why it remembers the name Jake instead of Simon. He is able to remember something with his father, not something Margie would have known. Charlie is able to have memories that Henry wouldn't have observed. Jake also has a vague memory of being forced to leave school, which isn't something the real Jake would have. Perhaps Jake's agony from his own terminal illness also contributed to bringing the doll to life. This story is set sometime in the late aughts to mid-2010s. Jake has a tablet and a laptop, but specifically so he can still do stuff and learn things from his sickbed. He's not of the iPad kid generation. He isn't able to play a parody of Fortnite or Roblox with his friends, and instead ends up isolated from them. One of his friends, Brandon, instead tries to bring him to the arcade. Margie also has a phone with a voice recording app on it. There is a common theory that the Jake McNally, who Greg babysits and Fetch, is this Jake. The timeline is compatible. Jake McNally is 4 and has a living mom. This Jake lost his mom when he was 5 and got cancer when he was 6. The real Jake, and thus the Stingers, taking place 5 years after Fetch, is perfectly plausible with the technology. The real Jake doesn't provide enough information on where it is set to say one way or another if it's in the same Oregonian town as Fetch, although it makes a lot of sense for the Stitch Wraith stories to all take place in the same general area, even if that area isn't anywhere close to a Freddy's we're familiar with, except for one detail, which we'll discuss later when it comes up. The next two stingers are flashbacks, finally giving us the Stitch Race POV and origin. Framed with Detective Larson remembering a strange fire he investigated, which the fifth stinger establishes as happening weeks before, we are introduced to the eccentric scientist Phineas Taggart, who was retired from pharmaceutical research and does fringe science in an abandoned factory. While him collecting haunted objects means the audience sees him as a remnant researcher, he never uses that term in his narration, although he is the friend and colleague of someone who does. Instead, he focuses on agony, albeit with a lowercase a. His work continues the motif from Fetch of real-world pseudoscientific concepts being related to FNAF's supernatural elements. He references homeopathy, electrodermal activity, which is a real thing but a topic of fascination in parapsychology, and Mauricio Emoto's ice crystal studies. But the latter could easily be true in the FNAF universe, with people's intentions and emotions affecting other people's minds and water molecules through the zero-point field. But I don't think him labeling what we would obviously as seeing as remnant-infused objects, but instead being infused by the emotional energy of agony, is an example of a completely wrong scientist getting wrecked by dark forces he has no idea about. The real Jake breaks what we understood the remnant rules to be, that if someone dies in contact with metal or comes into contact with metal shortly afterwards, they will possess it. Instead, Taggart's ideas are what make more sense here. Every week, Phineas receives a shipment of emotionally charged items. This week, it includes a mirror, paper party plates, and an endoskeleton. While the mirror witnessed a man murder his family, we don't learn the background of the other items. They could be associated with the Freddy's locations we're most familiar with or come from somewhere else entirely. He concentrates the agony he had gathered from the other items into the endoskeleton. He then gives it a face from the Simon/Real Jake doll and the battery from Fetch. Combined with electricity, the Stitch Wraith is born. It's possible that the ability with which Andrew and Jake are able to remember their names and the fact that they're dead has to do with the fact that they're working with quite a high level of remnant that has been mixed together from various sources. When the Stitch Wraith comes alive, Andrew kills Taggart on reflex, causing extreme pain and black tear streaks. Stinger number 1 establishes that the Stitch Wraith is considered responsible for a total of 5 deaths. Taggart is one, there are 2 who were likely attempting to mug them, and a third kill that occurs in the 4th stinger. It's a worker driving a truck transporting the Stitch Wraith, although how they ended up there when they walked out of Taggart's lab under their own power is unclear. Andrew contributes to this with his own rage, but all he wanted to do was zap, not kill, the first 2 victims. Jake wonders if perhaps it's a hitchhiker, which is eventually revealed to be Eleanor. She will be the focus of the next episode, but she is far more of an agony monster than a simply possessed animatronic. The Stingers specifically describe Remnant as looking like Quicksilver, while capital A agony is black. The pain the Stitch Wraith causes their victim is likely generating such concentrated agony that it leaks out of their brain/nervous system through their eyes. In universe, this has nothing directly to do with how spirits are depicted in minigames. Andrew's power is likely a result of the combination of Eleanor's presence and the highly concentrated agony of the Stitch Wraith. This is why Eleanor doesn't have these powers after she leaves the Stitch Wraith. Extreme pain and instant death can be achieved by manipulating only a few molecules in someone's brain. Stinger 4 consists of Andrew and Jake talking, becoming fully self-actualized and in control of their new existence, although it's Jake who physically runs the show. Andrew explains how he attached himself to the man who killed him and kept him alive, only for him to explode their shared essence across a bunch of stuff, including Fetch, until it broke down in a thunderstorm. Jake decides that he's going to track down all of the items tainted by Andrew's remnant, using their shared mind to track them down, even if Andrew doesn't agree. This explains everything we've seen the Stitch Wraith do thus far. Speaking of Andrew's backstory, it's now time for the fright story that has beguiled the fandom the most. The man in room 1280 deals with a John Doe who, despite all reason and logic, has remained alive in a coma for years. Its protagonist is Father Arthur Blythe, who has been summoned to the hospice wing of Heracles Hospital. He is led to room 1280, where he meets the titular man. As an integral Stinger story,
It's fact.
the parts of the fandom that don't reject Frights as largely irrelevant to gamesverse have come to the conclusion that John Doe is William Afton, being kept alive through the end of FNAF 6 and experiencing UCM while in a coma. The problem arises is that the vengeful spirit of UCM has blonde hair, while Andrew has dark hair. This isn't the kind of mistake that would happen on accident. The image of the vengeful spirit is a modified photo of one of Scott's sons. When it was made, he had no control over what the hair color was. However, when it comes to minor details like hair color, they're extremely easy to change in books. While the movie was restricted by what child actors they can find, and even changing the model in a video game takes time, it takes mere moments to change Andrew's hair color. Such a change could have been made between the time when Scott received an advanced reader copy of the final draft and when the book went to print. The same applies to the names Andrew versus Cassidy. Scott comes up with all the names of the major characters for the story. That's how ghostwriting works. Bunny Call, the book the story is in, came out well after the security logbook. The name Cassidy is so important that Scott, even in the Silver Eyes trilogy, where the spirit that possesses Golden Freddy is named Michael, a different MCI kid is still named Cassidy. Andrew is supposed to be the vengeful spirit of UCN. Why are these details so different? John Doe also has details that keep him from being William. What lay in the bed of room 1280 resembled a human being only vaguely, in that it had the requisite shape. It had a head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. There the similarity to humans ended. Scraptrap is missing an arm. And if Remnant can grow a limb, even on someone barely alive, then Scraptrap would have had a flesh arm. The remnant that is keeping the man alive isn't even able to regrow his skin. Additionally, after the man spells out Faz enter dissenter, Father Blythe asks for a phone book to figure out what he's trying to communicate. He's only 47. If this is many years after FNAF 6, he would pull out his phone and Google it. The scene would have been basically the same. Wikipedia lists 2012 as a date when many cities saw phone books as a waste of resources. If you use this as an approximate upper bound for when the story can take place, the technology in the stories that take place after it make a lot more sense than if you assume they have to be several years after 2015 at the absolute earliest. This isn't supposed to be William Afton and Cassidy, but someone else and Andrew in their own story paralleling that of the mainline FNAF games. I'll go into more detail with this idea when I cover the stinger where Detective Larson does identify this man as William. Father Blythe pushes through to disquiet the man's horrific form and spires and attempts to convince the hospital administration to let him take the man to the local Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, even while the nurses of the hospice wing attempt to kill him. They're foiled by the specter of Andrew, who has started appearing around the hospital, causing mischief and affecting physical objects in minor ways. This doesn't break FNAF's pre-existing ghost rules. If anywhere is haunted after historical sites of atrocities, it's hospitals. People are dying in them all the time, and at the very least, anyone with an implant is subsequently possessing them. People are in agony, fear, grieving their own deaths, and family members are doing the same. These are the same elements that cause the Simon doll to become haunted. The week before does a lot to give the sense that the Freddy's location itself is haunted, and if this is causing the paper pals to move and text to change, for Golden Freddy and It's Me to appear in Ralph's mind, it is reasonable for Andrew to appear and move things. Ralph and Bronwyn psychically receive knowledge of the names of an MCI kid, so the people of the hospital can receive knowledge of what Andrew looks like. Blythe eventually succeeds in getting the hospital to release the man into his care. I guess the reason he was forgotten was because all the research into his situation had already been conducted, and the nurses didn't want to alert a doctor that he found a way to communicate, and the significance of this didn't occur to the administrators Blythe was dealing with. This distribution center is still in use, distributing toys, and since some animatronics end up collected by the Stitch Ray, they're also distributing animatronics. This means that there are still some Freddy locations operating, or the Fazbear brand has become purely toy-based and instead provides animatronic manufacturing services to other companies. Since the Plush Trap Chaser is a brand new product, out of stock has to take place not too long after this. But that tracks with of the stories we've analyzed today. After the man in room 1280, out of stock is the one with the least contemporary technology. I do think that John Doe has a connection with Freddy's, as I'll discuss later, although obviously not as much as William does. Andrew might as well, if his murder was associated with the location. But I think the desire to go to the distribution center was primarily Eleanor's. She's the most powerful of the spirits inside the body, able to hide from both medical and supernatural observation, and she'd be the one who'd want to have their essence scattered across various items. Next episode, I will go into my theory about Eleanor's backstory, but she would know that Fazbear wouldn't be a company that would dispose of products contaminated with an unknown biohazard, and perhaps she is drawn there as well. The other stories featuring items likely contaminated by Andrew's remnant will be discussed in other videos, primarily in the next episode, which deals with most of the stories referenced by the rest of the Stingers. For now, we have one last story which potentially features Andrew. The New Kid is a much more of a standard Fright story than the last two lore-centric episodes I've analyzed. The protagonist is a kid named Devin. His only friend is Mick, and they're both pretty isolated at school. When a new kid named Kelsey comes to their school, he is jealous about the ease with which Kelsey is fitting in. This extends to Kelsey being able to befriend Devin and Mick, although Devin continues to find him annoying and suspicious. When Kelsey invites the boys to go to the hardware store with him, their plans are disrupted when Heather, Devin's crush, who finds him creepy, and her friends decide to join them. There isn't enough room for them, so Kelsey and the girls go first. And as Devin and Mick wait to get picked up, Devin decides that they've been abandoned, and so they leave. The following Monday, Devin invites Kelsey and Mick to explore an abandoned Freddy's on the outskirts of town. Devin has secretly been there before and wanted to trap Kelsey inside a spring-locked Fredbear he had found, just for a bit as revenge. But the spring locks fully activate. Devin berates and guilt trips Mick into leaving Kelsey for dead, but both boys continue to be haunted by guilt, and Devin goes back to make sure that he's dead. When Devin arrives, he can't find Kelsey's body inside the suit, seeing dark hair instead of blonde. He puts his arm inside the suit, and it swallows him up. The story then has a snap ending, showing an unharmed Kelsey being a new kid at a new school. Until the snap ending, this story seemed completely plausible. Ralph said that they only hid the Springlocks in most locations. This wouldn't be the Golden Freddy haunted by Cassidy, but a completely unrelated one, unhaunted until Kelsey got Springlocked. Devin's nightmares are the result of Kelsey psychically calling him. But with that snap ending, what makes the most sense is that this is an in-universe Frights.
A similar event took place
Where two kids got springlocked in an abandoned Freddy's. The character motivations in the story also work as propaganda if the real incident is two kids just getting stuck in a springlock suit inside an abandoned Freddy's. The one who climbed in all the way was actually a ghost, and the kid who got the Dave Afton treatment on his arm actually trying to free the first victim was experiencing karmic justice. And all the little details, like them hearing something moving in the Freddy's and the location not having service, are just horror tropes. The dark hair is used as evidence for Andrew to be the one possessing Golden Freddy, but that doesn't make any sense with what I've theorized thus far. And if it's supposed to be the Golden Freddy from the games, then why not give Kelsey dark hair and Devin find light hair, like the vengeful spirit in UCN? But, as Frights Fiction, it's just something spooky the in-universe author added. When Kelsey climbs in a suit, he doesn't find the rotting body of another kid. As for timeline, Mick has a smartphone and a laptop, despite his family not having enough money that he doesn't have to share a room with his sister. He does bring a separate camera on a hike, but it can be pretty difficult to use a phone to take a photo in full sunlight. There's also reference to the Twilight movies. I don't remember if the sparkly vampires were introduced in the first or second movies. I don't have to answer that question, as those movies are released in 2008 and 2009. And about a sci-fi show that followed an apocalyptic society in which people were killed for even the smallest mistakes, although I have no idea what that would be referencing. So, a date later into the 2010s, perhaps closer to the 2015 to 2017 range? Although the in-universe publication dates of the Fright stories is a topic for another video. Now that the Stitch Wraith has been linked to the fire at Taggart's factory lab, Detective Larson is looking back through the inventory of the site, and he notices one robotic dog, disassembled, manufactured by Fazbear Entertainment. This puts him in mind of the Freddy murders, presumably the MCI and perhaps the DCI. Just because the state couldn't prove in court that the kids were murdered doesn't mean that the police wouldn't think of it as a murder case, especially as the years passed and the idea of the kids still being alive became increasingly implausible. He then goes to the evidence lockup to pull out evidence for the fire, so far in the past that it was almost ancient history in the department, had never been solved. Larson didn't know a lot about it, but he did know that the fire was connected to one of the founders of Fazbear Entertainment. Wait, but I just said this was before FNAF 6. Indeed, but this doesn't have to be the FNAF 6 fire. What Larson finds in evidence is the puppet, all possessed and clearly the one haunted by Charlie Emily. while Lefty is absent from the ending cutscene, that could easily just be for timing reasons. The puppet is part of the tangle, and the whole point of this analysis is to present a narrative where the stingers don't cheapen Pizzeria Sim's ending. And if the case is ancient history, which probably means something more in the range of the 5 years Larson has been a detective, and maybe even before, why was Jake not hanging out with his friends playing online? So, what about the FNAF 3 file? The puppet is present in the horror attraction, but you only have to deal with the phantom puppet. This is likely an unpossessed security/prize puppet from a franchise location. It's hard to tell, but it looks like there might even be three of them. Why would the puppet be kept in evidence while the rest of the surviving memorabilia is auctioned off? Why would the newspaper be so misleading to the audience if it eventually became an unsolved arson case, instead of the police finding no evidence of Mike's actions and declaring it an accident? How is it ancient history of 2015 is the upper end of a reasonable time frame for the real Jake and thus the Stingers? How would it be linked to one of the founders? I think this is a completely new fire, perhaps at the FNAF 2 location after 1987. This would explain the puppet's absence in universe from the FNAF 1 location. It would also provide a reason for the implied long gap between 1987 and the opening of the FNAF 1 location in the week before. Now, this is getting real textually supported fanfic instead of a theory, but hear me out. To avoid having so many completely new fires, the FNAF 2 location burning down after it closes, the Wizards either avoiding the worst of it or having already been moved to another location for refurbishment, would also be the fire where Andrew's killer was burned up. Andrew possesses the killer because they ended up dying together, covering the killer in the remnant that would end up keeping him alive. The killer is implied to have been burned up wearing a springlock suit of some kind, as Blythe smells burnt meat, smoldering plastic, and molten steel when he first encounters him. And there's a good reason for it. He was a copycat killer. This is a real life phenomenon where it is often difficult to determine how many victims serial killers actually had because other people copy their methods. This would explain why the agony amalgamation that appears in the next stinger generates bunny ears. He was copying William's modus operandi, at least as much as was known by the public. Wearing a likely homemade replica of Spring Bonnie, doesn't have to be a functioning spring lock, just a mascot costume with metal reinforcements, he lured Andrew to the closed Freddy's location and killed him. This series has precedent for introducing a copycat villain to allow similar things to happen without truly bringing William back. That's literally what Glitchtrap is. The fire would have been the result of the puppet and/or the wizards attempting to stop him, since this killer had no idea about the safe room where he could avoid the animatronics. If the puppet was found in a position that made it look like they somehow started the fire, even if that seemed impossible to the investigators, that would explain why they were taken as evidence and the wizards weren't. If the fire only damaged part of the pizzeria, the wizards could have chased the killer there. The fire would also be what destroyed the toys, at least enough for Fazbear Entertainment to scrap them, in spite of their penchant for keeping old stuff around in case it's later useful, resolving that loose thread and destroying any remnant that could have been contained within them. As for this fire being connected to one of the founders of Fazbear's, that would be from Henry or William poking into the fire so much that it was deemed suspicious. They both would have been trying to figure out if the fire changed the animatronics' behavior. Keeping an eye on them was what William was doing as the night guard before the player in FNAF 2, and possibly as Dave in the week before. If it is Henry, this inspired him to eventually figure out that fire cancels possession. ID's fantasy has a theory that the original physical animatronics were obtained by Henry after FNAF 3. If the puppet was out doing their own thing, instead of hanging unanimated in the FNAF 3 location, Henry wouldn't have been able to obtain them, so he had to make Lefty. Between the animatronics of FNAF 6, that theory, and my theory here, all animatronics are completely accounted for, cleansed in flame. So, here's my proposed timeline for the stories and stingers covered thus far, in case you've gotten lost. Now, for this to be in the evidence archives of Larson's police precinct, he has to be in Washington County, Utah, regardless of which fire this actually was, which means all of the Stitchline stories, including the real Jake, have to take place within reasonable driving/untiring animatronic walking distance of each other. The only exception to this would be Fetch, as, in my theory, Dare would have brought the animatronic from Utah to Oregon, and then Taggart did the same thing in reverse when he purchased it. So that means that Jake McNally probably isn't our Jake. So Fetch isn't required to take place 5 years before the real Jake. After Larson takes the puppet, we cut to the Stitch Ray, having gathered all of the items infected by Andrew and getting ready to throw them into a trash compactor. The only note I have about this part of the stinger is that it ends with Jake about to leave the stage wraith by escaping into his happiest day. This mechanic comes up again in later stingers as Jake gives this piece to other people. Candy Bunny's FNAF World video includes showing how this aligns perfectly with the rules of helping spirits move on that is present in FNAF World/3. But unlike Remnant, no living character has ever made reference to this in any continuity. So I don't think it's reasonable to assume that this is something that exists as folklore or fringe science in universe. Therefore, this aspect of the stingers is evidence against total Frights fiction. Larson arrives at the warehouse as the Stitch Wraith is beginning to destroy all of the infected objects. Andrew moves to kill him, but to prevent that, Jake jumps into the trash compactor. Andrew's killer's will begins to manifest in the mass of metal, and Jake, drawing on his happy memory and intention, sends Andrew away, causing him to move on. Thinking the Stitch Wraith is dead, Larson starts to make a voice memo into a tape recorder. But since Maggie uses a phone to make voice memos, I don't think this is timeline evidence. But it is what Larson says that continues to plague me. I think the stuff in the compactor came from the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, and also the site where the serial killer William Afton, the one notorious for wearing a rabbit costume, died. The first part supports my theory that the fire Larson looked into is the one that Andrew's killer burned up in. He knows of the Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center because his investigation led him to looking into the fire's survivor, and whatever kind of police report you file when someone who shouldn't be alive explodes over a bunch of merchandise. But the second part has made a complete loss. It's reasonable for Larson to think of William as a notorious serial killer, even if he was released for lack of evidence. But where does Larson think he died? Option 1 is the FNAF 1 location after Springtrap was retrieved. Fazbear Entertainment is never calling all the cops about the bloodstains in the storeroom. And even if they did, DNA testing was first used by the police in 1986, and it took a while for its use to become routine and available everywhere. William's DNA wouldn't be on file from when the MCI was investigated. The only way his bloodstains could be matched to him is Dave, since presumably Elizabeth didn't receive a normal burial. He would have to be exhumed, and then their Y chromosomes would be matched. Police aren't doing archaeology on some bloodstains to solve a cold case they couldn't arrest anyone for. And even if they wanted to, while I couldn't find any evidence about recovering DNA from decades-old bloodstains, it seems unlikely. Although remnant preventing decomposition could affect things. But that doesn't matter. The police are never investigating the FNAF 1 safe room. Option 2 is in the ruins of the FNAF 3 location after it burned down. Even though I don't think FNAF 3 has happened yet. Let's suppose Springtrap left behind various stains and pieces of his organic body. Police are unlikely to even notice that they aren't special effects inside the horror attraction, especially if no one is believed to go missing, although that does depend on if Mike sticks around to answer questions. But they still wouldn't have any sample to compare it against unless they went to an inconceivable amount of effort. Option 3 is after FNAF 6. This time there is the additional option of forensic dentistry, except the back teeth on Springtrap are so messed up they must have shifted during his time as an animatronic. They do provide a stable source of DNA, but again, there are the same problems. Besides, if you forget all my crazy theories and go with the surface level reading that William is the man in 1280 and Frights is in its own continuity, then Scraptrack is a John Doe and Larson wouldn't know where William died. So in conclusion, I have no idea what Larson is talking about. I'd love to hear your all thoughts on this. Okay, back on track. While Larson is making that extremely bizarre statement, a massive 15-foot tall amalgamation of everything the Stitch Wraith has gathered rises out of the trash compactor to attack him. Jake sending Andrew away means he is temporarily free of the amalgamation, but he is being pulled into it. He tries to use specifically his intention to protect himself and prevent other things from being pulled into the amalgamation. I think this level of pseudokinesis from both Jake and the amalgamation is believable. They're both essentially supercharged. The amalgamation is powered by Eleanor, and the Stitch Wraith skeleton was packed with remnant/agony by Taggart. Affecting probability, the way the 0-point field does, already requires minute manipulation of physical reality. Guessing an REG requires changing the properties of the entropic system it is based on. Making a dice give a different result means changing how it falls and bounces. The animatronics already often do things that don't seem plausible for their actual physical forms. This is Remnant at its greatest concentration. Jake ends up fighting with Eleanor when he realizes that she is the core of the evil that he sensed in the objects he had collected. Part of this evil is inside him, which she sucks out before letting herself be completely consumed by the amalgamation. Simultaneously, Larson comes to the realization that he is facing William Afton. I hope everything I've demonstrated thus far means you don't agree with him at all. All the Fright stories are written in third-person limited POV, the narration filtered by the perspective and biases of the POV characters. This is just what he thinks is happening. Afton's own crimes overshadow the copycat, and the John Doe what doesn't seem like he was treated like a criminal suspect, so it's possible the fire obscured Andrew's own murder completely. Larson looked into the overwhelming history of murders associated with Fazbear Entertainment, unaware that most of them weren't directly relevant to his situation. He had William Afton on the brain, which is the reason why Larson sees his face in the trash. Face pareidolia is a real-life psychological phenomenon where people see faces that aren't really there. This extends to someone identifying such faces with those you've already seen. The most famous of this is seeing religious figures in pieces of toast, something that Frights has already referenced. Taggart's collection includes the Madonna's image on toast, amongst metal torture elements and objects that at very least have enough longevity to be exposed to agony. Toast is extremely the odd item out. But it does set up how there is simultaneous going to both be and not be an epic confrontation with William Afton. For the record, the amalgamation only calls itself agony. Urged on by the puppet, communicating with Larson in the same way It's Me as described in the week before, Larson attacks Agony by getting into a forklift and driving it towards the lake. All hope is almost lost until Eleanor decides to bounce, probably because she had successfully reunified all her essence, since she made sure to suck that out of the Stitch Ray. Turns out that she was the driving force behind the amalgamation, not Andrew's killer. The puppet is able to seize control and disassemble the amalgamation and drive it into the lake. They join the rest of the objects in their watery grave, but given the way the puppet gets around is so unclear they can probably get out. Unlike the rest of the objects, they are very strongly possessed, undamaged, and still have their animating power. This stinger and story arc ends with Jake heating up his hand to burn the small piece of Eleanor's agony that entered Larson when he was being stabbed by the amalgamation. Unlike Remnant, agony seems to have a harmful effect on living beings. This difference in properties will be very important for Eleanor's motivation in the remaining stingers. She seems to be a major source of agony, but lacks her own remnant. Jake flees the warehouse/factory as he realizes that Eleanor was the true animating force behind everything he had faced so far, and she is so much worse than Andrew's killer. We will also be facing Eleanor next episode, analyzing the rest of the Stingers as well as the remaining Stitchline stories, except for Into the Pit. Even without needing to analyze the game as well, once the ball pit's appearances in the later Stingers is taken into account, I have no idea how to explain it. I'm hoping that Return to the Pit might provide more information for me to work with. I hope you've enjoyed this video and my crazy theories. I know a lot of it verges into textually supported fanfic territory. I hope at the very least I showed how Stitchline isn't an open and shut case, and the sources of friction within the gameverse continuity can be accommodated for without too much twisting. And so for those of you who want as much of Fazbear Frights to be canon as possible, here you go. I will eventually cover all of the Fright stories, stockpiling videos and releasing them a week apart, unless I can't get them all done before my breakouts. Then there will likely be a months-long hiatus, but I'll try my best to work on them even during school. Then, no more videos, except for perhaps a correction or response video or two. I won't be covering Tales from the Pizza Plet stories, as the situation is still developing. The Tales game situation changed dramatically 2 days before when I'm writing this script, and we still don't know the Mimic's secret. Additionally, Tales was published before the era it deals with was completed, and how Security Breach shook out has likely changed the way Scott handles collaborative storytelling. Normally, this is where a YouTuber would ask you to subscribe and like the video, and while doing that is more than welcome, the reason I put in all this effort to make this video instead of just enjoying the ideas inside my head is so that I can hear other people's thoughts on this. So please, share whatever you have to say. I'll try to reply to every comment, and I will be very surprised if I'm unable to keep up. Absol out.